I'll keep this next entry short, because there's really not much information about it online. But what there is absolutely horrifying. Ray J. Sharif Black was a nurse practitioner anaesthetist from Baltimore, whose life was seemingly crumbling around him. For 3 years, he had been having trouble with his ex-wife, Wendy Black, who, according to Jay, didn't let him see his kids. Wendy had filed multiple protection orders against Jay, saying that she didn't feel safe around him and feared for her life. All of her requests were denied by the court. Jay eventually moved on from Wendy and ended up having some children with his new girlfriend, Tara LeBang. But by the end of 2021, things had turned sour between them, and Jay and Tara separated. Jay began to worry that his life was about to repeat itself. And on December 11th, 2021, he snapped. That afternoon, he began a Facebook livestream from outside a house, talking to his viewers about the issues he was having with his ex-wife Wendy, the drawn-out custody battle he'd been dealing with, and the allegedly false accusations that he was having to defend himself from. He then began saying how he had just gotten into an argument with his other ex, Tara. For the first 50 seconds of the video, it appeared as if this stream was just a way for Jay to let off some steam, to get some things off his chest, to confide in any of his Facebook friends who would listen. But it soon became apparent that that wasn't his intention at all. This video wasn't an appeal for sympathy. It was a confession. After bringing up his trouble with Tara, Jay dropped a bombshell that none of his friends saw coming. One that completely changed the tone of the video.
You know, we got in a fight. First thing she does is threatening that she's going to do the same thing. You're never going to see your kids, blah, blah, blah. It's the holidays, man. I don't have no family, nothing. Anyway, I just did something crazy, man. I just shot my ex-girlfriend in the head, yo. Felt like a dream. Like, I never thought I would be that guy.
Jay wasn't lying. When the authorities caught wind of the livestream, they immediately went to Tara's home in South Baltimore. Inside, they found her lifeless body, sprawled out on the floor. Jay had put a hole through her head. But unfortunately, that wasn't where the video ended. In the final moments of the stream, Jay says that this all really started with his ex-wife Wendy. And so, quote, "She next. Then I'm gonna do myself too." And that's when we find out where he'd been streaming this whole time. From just outside Wendy's house.
I can't go to prison, so the person that really started my depression and all of this is my ex-wife. So she next, and then I'm going to do myself too. But I just wanted to say this to people. Don't play with people's emotions, man. Don't lie on these men. Oh, here's my ex-wife right here. Today's the day.
Today's the day. Again, Jay wasn't joking. In the final moments of the video, we can see Wendy, who was pregnant at the time, peeking out of her front door as Jay quickly approaches her. The video cuts as he forces his way into her home. Seconds after ending the stream, Jay shot Wendy, and then calmly picked up his 2 daughters, put them inside the car parked in the driveway, and walked back inside the house. Finally, he ended his own life with a blast to the head. Needless to say, this is a very harrowing video. The calmness in Jay's voice as he explains what he's done and what he's about to do. Somehow, that relaxed demeanor makes the clip all the more chilling. Jay mentioned in the stream how he didn't want to spend the holidays alone. But, after his selfish actions, that's exactly the position he left his kids in, after slaying their mothers and himself. Despite its relatively small size, Byron Bay is one of Australia's premier tourist destinations. Nearly 2 million people visit the coastal town each year. In 2019, 18-year-old Theo Hayes was amongst them. The young Belgian national was drawn to Byron for the same reasons as most travellers his age. the town's beautiful beaches, great surfing spots, and its chilled out, relaxed atmosphere. For much of the year, backpackers and tourists make up the majority of Byron's population. It's a transient sort of town, a place where some people go to find themselves, and where others go to lose themselves. Unfortunately, in Theo's case, his trip to Byron was an escape from which he would never return. Theo had been exploring Australia for the better part of a year by the time he arrived in Byron. He'd spent much of his time down under with his cousin, Lisa Hayes, who described Theo as being a responsible and level-headed traveller. According to her, he wasn't that typical young tourist who loves partying, and was instead much more interested in experiencing Australian culture and immersing himself in the country's natural beauty. Still, meeting people and making connections is what travelling's all about, and since Theo didn't know anyone when he arrived in Byron, he got to talking with some other young people at the Wake Up hostel where he was staying. These fellow backpackers invited Theo to join them for some drinks in town. The young Belgian was scheduled to fly home to Europe the following week, so he figured, why not? One last adventure in Oz. On May 31st, Theo and one of his new acquaintances caught a shuttle bus into town. They were seen on CCTV at 7:45 PM, buying a bottle of wine and acting normally. They both then returned to the Wake Up hostel and shared the bottle with some other friends that they had made. Later that evening, Theo and his new companions went back into town once again and paid a visit to an infamous bar called Cheeky Monkey's, a short distance from Byron's main area. Now Cheeky Monkey's had something of a reputation at the time. It was ranked as one of the most violent bars in all of Australia, well known for its dodgy clientele, aggressive bouncers, and for the poor lighting in the surrounding area. Most of the locals knew better than to go there. But Theo wasn't a local, and nor were his new friends. With the end of May being somewhere between autumn and winter in Australia, it was obviously the off-season period, and as such, it was a particularly quiet night inside Cheeky Monkey's. In fact, the bar was only at about 1/4 capacity. Still, judging by the surveillance footage, Theo was having a fun time nonetheless, and was seen dancing on the bar with the other backpackers he had met. At about 11 PM, Theo bought 2 drinks at the bar, before promptly being escorted out the building by security. According to the guard who kicked him out, Theo was a polite young man, but had clearly had too much to drink and was stumbling all over the place. Other witnesses at the bar contradicted this though, and said that Theo was actually completely sober when he was kicked out, and wasn't being loud or rude or aggressive in any way. According to them, the security guard's decision to kick him out seemed completely random and unprovoked. Looking at the CCTV footage of Theo exiting the premises, he didn't appear to be intoxicated, though of course that's up for interpretation. The guard made him stand on an X to have his photo taken. Theo appears confused in the footage, but goes along with the whole rigmarole. At 11:07 PM, the security cameras captured Theo walking off by himself down Kingsley Street and into the cold, quiet night. This was the last time Theo Hayes was ever seen alive. After exiting the camera's field of view, he vanished off the face of the earth, never to be seen again. To begin with, everyone assumed that when Theo left the bar, he began walking back towards his hostel. That of course made perfect sense, seeing how his accommodation wasn't too far from town and he could have easily made the journey on foot. But as detectives would come to learn after analysing his Google location data, Theo never made it back to the Wake Up hostel that night. In fact, he didn't even get close. Soon after leaving the area, Theo sent a series of text messages in French to his friends back in Belgium. That's likely who he was messaging in this footage. At some point after that, he watched a portion of a TV show on YouTube and sent his sister a message on WhatsApp. On several occasions, he opened Google Maps to search for routes back to his hostel. Clearly, he was planning on heading back at some point. However, according to his mobile records, he actually took an extremely bizarre route after leaving the bar, and walked in the opposite direction of the hostel, towards a youth activity centre down Tennyson Street. He then spent 7 minutes standing in a sporting field, a field where homeless people and drifters were known to stay. At 11:30 p.m, he began walking extremely quickly through the Milne track towards Tallow Beach, moving at 7.5 kilometers an hour. With no streetlights in that part of town, it would have been very dark with no signs of life, and Theo would have been well aware that he was heading in the wrong direction and away from civilization. Still, as the data shows, he continued on through the thick bushland in a near straight line. Considering just how treacherous the bush along the Milne track is, that seemed like an almost impossible task, especially considering that Theo wasn't familiar with the area. As he made his way through the shrub, he never once slowed down and continued walking at a very fast pace. He finally exited the bushland and made it onto the beach, after which he began heading in the direction of Cozy Corner, towards Byron Bay's lighthouse. During all that time, Theo continued texting his friends and sister as if nothing was out of the ordinary. His messages were coherent and didn't give off the impression that he was distressed or in trouble. At 12:56 a.m, Theo sent his final message to a friend he had made in Australia. Just 6 minutes later, his phone suddenly switched to sleep mode and stopped transmitting data. Strangely, his phone came back online at around 6 a.m. and connected to a cell tower in Cape Byron one final time at 1:47 p.m. After that, his phone never pinged again. In the following days, Theo failed to call his family back in Belgium. That was completely out of character for him. He usually stayed in close contact with his parents, so they immediately began to sense that something was off. When June 6th rolled around and he still hadn't called, his family reported him missing. A huge search and rescue effort was launched. It involved helicopters, drones, cadaver dogs, trackers, divers, and even rock climbers. The local community even banded together, putting up missing person posters and helping hunt for the young man. Theo's parents flew out to Australia and made a passionate appeal for any information that would help them find their son. But by that point, the trail had already frozen over. They couldn't find a single trace of the young man anywhere. His passport and personal belongings were still in his private room at the hostel. In July, volunteers came across Theo's grey Puma baseball cap, nestled in the brush near Tallows Beach. So, what happened to Theo Hayes? Well, here are a few of the main theories. Theory 1. Theo left Cheeky Monkeys, and, for whatever reason, decided to go on a solo adventure through the bushland. He somehow made it to the beach, and began climbing up the beachside cliffs towards the famous lighthouse. This act of misadventure ended in tragedy, with Theo falling from the rocks and into the sea. His last known location was at Tallows Beach after all, and it would explain why his body still hasn't been found. Then again, if Theo ended up in the ocean and was swept away or taken by a shark, how could his phone have reconnected at 1:47 p.m. and pinged off a cell phone tower? It's possible he dropped his phone before falling in the water, but that doesn't explain why the device still hasn't been found to this day, or why an otherwise sensible and risk-averse young man would do something so reckless and out of character. His inhibitions may have been lowered at the time, but as the CCTV footage shows, he almost certainly wasn't that drunk. Theory 2. Theo was murdered. It doesn't make sense that a young man, with no knowledge of the local area, would have been able to travel the Milne track alone at night. According to people who know the area, it's simply far too complex, dense, and difficult to traverse without knowing where you're going. And for him to have taken the unapparent detour towards Tallow Beach, well, that's an obscure route which only a local would know to take. You have to pass down a small path by a gully and an abandoned campsite, and it's not the kind of place you just stumble across. In the minds of many, Theo had to have met someone after leaving Cheeky Monkeys. A local, perhaps in the field where he spent 7 minutes standing around. This local then led him through the thick shrubbery of the Milne track with promises of showing him the lighthouse or taking him to a secret party. This local then either killed Theo, hurt him badly, or left him to fend for himself. It's unclear what their motive would have been, but again, human intervention would explain why his body was never found. It's entirely possible that Theo's buried out in the bushland somewhere, or that he was taken and driven somewhere even more remote. This theory would also explain why he took such a bizarre route. He likely wouldn't have gone in that direction if he wasn't being led by someone, and his text messages implied that he felt comfortable and not lost. Theory 3. Theo's Google Maps simply bugged out and gave him a bad route back to the hostel. Unfamiliar with the area, he followed Google's directions without question, assuming that the dark and desolate route must have been a detour. He unfortunately got lost, ended up on the beach, and then turned back the way he had come. Now, stuck wandering around the hostile bushland, he eventually succumbed to the elements. It was a particularly cold night after all, Byron's coldest May night on record in fact. His remains could still be out there somewhere, laying undiscovered deep in the brush. This theory, however, doesn't explain why he never once tried to call for help, or why he didn't message anyone about his dire situation. There's a myriad of other possible theories that people have come up with. Someone gave him bad directions. He had wittingly or unwittingly taken some sort of substance. Someone stole his phone and ran off with it. All of these theories have their own set of merits and inconsistencies. Unfortunately, we simply don't know what exactly happened to Theo, though I think it's safe to assume he's no longer alive. But why did he take such a strange route? Why was he moving so quickly through the brush? Why did his phone enter sleep mode, only to reactivate hours later? And why has his body never been found? For his family's sake, I'm hoping we'll be able to answer those questions in the near future. If you know what happened to Theo, there's currently a $500,000 reward for any information relating to his case.